1 year after St. Francis wrote his rule of 1223, he went to the town of Cortona. They had a friary there that had been built very early on. And he was spending time there in prayer and reflection. And there was so much opposition to the rule that he wrote that he wanted to clarify it or make it clear how we as friars can actually live the rule. And so he wrote his testament. And he even says he wrote the testament so that we can, in a more Catholic manner, observe the rule that was given to us. And it's very beautiful because it begins with a reflection about the early days and how Francis began and how he left the world. He talked about how the Lord led him to the lepers and his experience there where he met Christ and the lepers. He speaks about his leaving the world, his conversion to Christ in that sense of the transformation of his life and how the Lord gave him the grace to do penance. It's interesting because penance didn't just mean, bodily penance or fasting and so forth. Penance meant metanoia, conversion. And so Francis began a life of penance. And he talks about that in the Testament. Then he talks about his love for the priesthood, his love for the Eucharist, his love for the Holy Scriptures, his love for the Roman Missal, which has the words of consecration in them. And then he talks about the early days of the friars, how they were content to have one tunic patched inside and out, and how they had just one pair of pants, and the poverty they lived and the joy that they had in living in that poverty. Francis goes on then to speak about the divine office and how much he loves the divine office. He even says in it that if the brothers don't pray the divine office according to the Roman Church, he doesn't even consider them Catholic. And he talks about poverty in it as well and the seriousness of following that radical poverty. And in the end, Francis talks about not putting gloss upon the rule, about really living the life as Christ gave it to us, and not to be afraid to do that. The Testament is such a beautiful, beautiful document where Francis really expresses his heart and how he believes we should be living the rule that he gave us. Now, over the centuries, the Franciscans fought over the Testament just like they did over the rule. 4 years after his death, it was kind of interesting because the friars weren't sure if they had to obey the Testament as well as the rule. And the reason why they brought that up was because St. Francis wrote that whenever they read the rule, they had to read the Testament with it. And the two were always to be kept together. The other reason being was that the Testament has many, many directives in it, has many obediences in it, admonitions in it, counsels from St. Francis. And so it comes across as another rule, even though Francis says in it, this is not another rule. And so the Franciscans were like, well, do we have to obey it or do we not have to obey it? And another reason why was because in the rule, St. Francis says that the friars are bound to obey Brother Francis and his successors. And so can a successor say something or decree something contrary to St. Francis, since by the rule we're bound to obey Francis and the successors? So the Testament was Francis's obediences to all of us in how to observe the rule. So in 1230, Pope Gregory IX, who used to be Cardinal Ugolino, who was the Cardinal Protector of the Order, and he had known St. Francis very well, a good friend of Francis. And so he said, no, he said the Testament does not have to be observed, but it's noble to observe it, in his document, Quo Elongati. But the friars weren't satisfied. Those who wanted more of a mitigated life, they wanted to relax the life, they said, well, the Testament, we really don't need that. But those who wanted to live the radical life, like the spirituals or the observants later on, or even the Capuchins, they were like, no, we have to observe the Testament if we're going to observe the rule as Francis wanted us to observe it. The controversy continued up until the Capuchin Reform. In the Capuchin Reform, the friars said, well, Pope Gregory IX is right. We don't have to observe it, but we're going to observe it. We're going to write into our constitutions that we observe the Testament of St. Francis. And I think that's what helped keep the Capuchin Reform so strong and stable for 300 years, is because they not only professed the rule and kept it, they not only professed the Testament and kept it, but they were able to build a guard around the two of them. And so if you want to understand the rule of Francis, you have to look at it in light of his testament. It's a very beautiful document that really shows us, as St. Francis said, how to live the rule in a more Catholic manner.